Rewarding elements are what truly compels people to start investing their time into a video game. When you think of games you like, chances are you don't think about the tight controls or the intuitive user interface, rather you think of the rewarding elements that the game is associated with. If you've ever been unsure as to what game you want to play, chances are you've looked up gameplay footage or a review of the game to see if it's a good game or not. The problem with this is that many reviews are heavily biased towards a certain demographic of people. Therefore, it is important to understand what you want out of a game so that you can figure out whether a game is worth your time or not. Because of this, games have been categorized into genres, and this has created yet another problem, because you see, video game genres do a terrible job at informing people on whether or not a game is worth their time. Because of genres, many game developers have essentially pigeonholed their games so that they can fit their target demographic. The purpose of this video is to prevent this issue and offer an alternative solution, rewarding elements. Now, there have been numerous theories related to this, but I feel that my theory is a little bit more fleshed out and accurate than those theories. There are many different types of rewarding elements out there, and the value of these rewarding elements will differ for each individual. The first is what I like to call exploration. Now, many will be led to believe that exploration is related to games like Metroid or open world games like Skyrim. There are many games out there that are labelled with the action-adventure genre, but technically speaking, these games are usually action games with puzzle elements. They have absolutely nothing to do with adventuring whatsoever. The Legend of Zelda is one of these games, and anyone who has played The Legend of Zelda knows that the game has you fighting enemies with what is often a very basic combat system and solving complex puzzles, as well as fighting bosses that usually requires the player to solve a puzzle in order to beat. When I think of exploration, I do not think about the mechanics of the game, rather I think of the value of the game's world. Now, I'm not strictly talking about narrative here. Though it could be considered a component, I am talking about level design, art design, music, and just about anything that contributes to a game's atmosphere. Exploration is about feeding the player's curiosity and getting them attached to the game's world quickly. Examples of games that focus on this rewarding element are Valkyrie Profile 2 Silmeria, Painkiller, and Baton Kaitos. The second rewarding element is what I like to call Kinetic Empowerment. The purpose of Kinetic Empowerment is to essentially transform the gameplay loop itself into a rewarding experience. This goes beyond just gameplay mechanics. It actually has a lot to do with art, music, and animation. It has to both look appealing on screen as well as feel appealing in terms of how the player plays it. Of course, the game has to be mechanically appealing as well. Therefore, the game needs to have tight controls and the animations need to be fluid. Depending on what type of game you're going for will depend on what you want to add to enhance this rewarding experience. Perhaps there's a risk-reward factor that keeps players on their toes the whole time, or perhaps there's numerous attacks that the player can use to mix up their experience. Ultimately though, the game has to utilise all the design elements in harmony with the gameplay loop to give the player the feeling of excitement that would usually be associated with a roller coaster ride. I mean, why else would you go on a roller coaster? To feel the rush. That's why, and that's what Kinetic Empowerment is all about. Examples of games that focus on this rewarding element are F-Zero GX, Devil May Cry 3, and Sengoku Basara. The third rewarding element is narrative. I think this one pretty much speaks for itself really. Creating an engrossing story that encourages players to form connections to the characters, with interesting themes for players to reflect on. World building also plays a big part in creating a strong narrative, though it plays an equally important part in exploration as well. Believe it or not, writing is not the only way to deliver a strong narrative. Art, music, and animations also play their part in conveying a strong narrative. After all, a character's appearance can do a great job at conveying their personality and background. Smart developers can also use them as a facade to fool players into making false assumptions. Very rarely do games attempt to use gameplay mechanics in an attempt to bolster a game's narrative, and I would argue that doing so can be detrimental to the overall experience. One example of an attempt to merge narrative with gameplay is the Ravine Caverns dungeon in Valkyrie Profile 2 Silmeria. Due to events in the game's story, the player has a time limit to make their way through this long, arduous dungeon, and if they fail to do so in time, it is game over. Many players may be infuriated by such a design choice, so it may be wise not to do such a thing. In any case, some examples of games that focus on this rewarding element are Grandia 2 and Warcraft 3. The fourth rewarding element is invested empowerment, the feeling of players growing stronger as they keep playing a game. There are many ways to incorporate invested empowerment into a game, but the most common method is to add a leveling system. This is due to the fact that the role-playing game genre has pigeonholed developers for so long that they see it as a mandatory thing. The truth is that invested empowerment can apply to just about any game. Since most games use leveling systems, and many of you are familiar with them already, I want to bring up an alternative method of incorporating invested empowerment, this being the tarot card system found in the Painkiller series. This is one of the most ingenious methods of invested empowerment I have ever seen in a first-person shooter, as it requires players to satisfy certain conditions to be rewarded with these cards. I absolutely love this, because the game doesn't just hand you growth on a platter like most games. You actually have to earn your empowerment by being good at the game, and by doing so you get an equipable perk that is either a passive effect or an ability that players can trigger manually. I also like how players can choose simply not to use the cards should they desire a more challenging experience. There are many games out there that emphasize invested empowerment more than Painkiller though. Arguably the best example of such a game would be Star Ocean: The Second Story. Nothing else comes even remotely close, at least from what I've played. The fifth rewarding element is personalization, which is all about giving players agency and allowing them to insert their own creativity into the experience. Finding games that offer personalization is surprisingly not as difficult as one might think, as many mainstream sports games actually do a fantastic job at incorporating features that allow for players to personalize their experience, and I find that developers of these games do not get the credit they deserve, mainly because a lot of people who buy these games tend not to appreciate nor care for these features. I for one absolutely love them, and this just goes to show why rewarding elements are so much more accurate than genres when it comes to defining one's tastes. Of course, there are many other games that allow players to personalize their experience in more ways than offering creative modes. Decision making can play a big part in personalization as well. Each decision is unique and personal for the player. Sure, you can be entirely logical with your decision making if you want to, or you can roleplay your decisions by essentially placing metagame rules on your character that dictate a certain playstyle, and seeing how well you do. For example, if I'm a kind and generous ruler, I'm going to think twice about pillaging a nearby village for resources, as even though those resources could be put to good use, it would not be in my character's nature to do such a thing, so I personally forbid it. The best example of a game that effectively incorporates personalization is Mountain Blade, as it is the greatest role-playing experience to have been built around a video game format to date. Nothing even comes remotely close. Other examples of games that feature personalization are the Dynasty Warriors Empires games, Space Engineers, WWE games, Soul Calibur 6, and Need for Speed Carbon. Finally, we have the sixth and final rewarding element, which is what I like to call educated empowerment. This is my least desired rewarding element personally, but it is a rewarding element that many gamers consider to be the most important. Educated empowerment is all about giving players a challenging experience, expecting players to learn as they play. The satisfaction that comes from learning how to play the game and overcoming each and every obstacle is essentially the reward itself. Now personally, I'm not fond of this because I lack the patience to play challenging games and get easily frustrated, so I cannot name many examples of games that do this well, aside from games that I've already mentioned such as F-Zero GX and Devil May Cry 3. But God Hand is without a doubt the game that I associate with educated empowerment the most. To make an experience challenging is not an easy thing to do. You have to carefully balance the game to make it possible, but difficult to overcome. And to do this, you need to make the tools available to the player in order to allow them to succeed, while making the tools difficult to properly utilize. It is also highly recommended that you make the player a glass cannon for maximum satisfaction. So now that you know all 6 rewarding elements, I encourage all of you to leave a comment in the comment section ranking each and every one of these rewarding elements from best to worst in terms of which ones are the most important for you. Or alternatively, you can make a video response and link it in the comments if you want. This way we can better understand each other's tastes in games. In any case, I'll see you guys next time.